they're a nice group of people. I'm Canadian and they're in Canada, so I was like, yeah, I'll hop on board the CanCon wagon and do this with you. Which you sacrifice the eyes of a larger platform like Kickstarter, but I think the space can afford more competition. So here I am, trying to fund a tabletop role playing game on a smaller platform like Crowdfunder. Because
Yeah.
working with people, good people, is more important, I think, a
I
lot of
mean,
the times.
we've already, I mean, there's no time limit to this, but like if it gets too long, then we may have to cut some of the previous stuff out. But I do want to ask you about you mentioned CanCon, and I listened to enough things made in Canada that I know that's like, it's mandated, right? Like you have to have enough can, you have to have enough, whatever that is, Canadian content to if you're a media producer,
All
right?
right, you
But
want to do this? You want to do this? We can do
well,
this
no,
because this is my job. We can do this. All right. So
well, but I'm curious, like if that applies, or is it just you just saying a joke because it's a thing, or does that actually apply in your case? Like,
okay, Matthew, there's a lot going on there. All right. So in the 1970s, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, decided that, well, I'm being a little bit facetious, but it actually is the case.
yeah,
There was a big propaganda push in the 70s to establish Canadian identity, or to try and come up with a Canadian identity that wasn't simply multiculturalism. The flag was only invented in 1967. It was voted on, and
you
so
probably
a lot,
flew the Union Jack before that, right, or something like that.
yeah. Um, so there was a big push. A lot of the Canadian iconographic images, like I mean, the Mountie had already existed, but like proliferating the Mountie and the moose and the beaver and like all these little Great White North, blah blah blah. It all came out of a very specific propaganda push. Not to be cynical about it, but it was like mandated by the Canadian government. Part of that was the formation of the Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC. In the United States, the FCC is a broker for the airwaves. It administers transactions of people buying different airspaces. Canada took its inspiration from Great Britain in many structures, legally and socially. And just as in Great Britain, airwaves are public property in Canada. So when you apply for a license to the CRTC, you are operating in trust for the people of Canada. The CRTC is set up in trust. So it's because you have to demonstrate that you are responsible enough to be upheld for the sake of the people of Canada. So it's not, you don't own the airwaves. Um, and as such, there are certain mandates about how much you can broadcast that has to be Canadian content to be within public interest, because there was a concern in the 70s of Canadian cultural identity, which had taken quite a bit of money and quite a bit of years to try and like invent, basically. I mean,
Uh,
to that it being swallowed up by the economic might of the United States of America, and its tremendous cultural capital that was being spit out across the world of amazing quality of television and movies and this and that, and that the Canadian identity would be utterly
Also,
lost.
a lot of volume volume, like,
Yeah,
and
volume,
proximity. We're very close together.
proximity, and just sheer economic might. Because the Canada is its population is roughly equivalent to a smaller state in the United States, like
Yeah.
Ohio or something, right? So just in terms of the numbers, it's staggering, and the money is just staggering because you just don't have the same volume. So there are a lot of mandates for Canadian content. How this comes back, I know I've been talking about radio, but how this comes back to publishing is it's difficult for a Canadian publisher to compete in an international market, which basically just means in the US market, right? Which through the books that I sell as Radio James Games, probably 2/3 of them or more are to the States, which becomes very tricky when we involve Canada Post and Canadian Postal Service, and which is again a public institution, has a monopoly, and makes things very difficult for international competition. So if your publication in Canada says in it that it's made in Canada and meets certain criteria, as in like the majority. There are finer specifics, but the majority of staff members who worked on it or people who contributed to it are Canadian. It makes you eligible for certain Heritage Canada grants and other financial incentives or practical incentives that will assist you in competing in the US market. Not that I've ever qualified for any of them, but or been in receipt of any of them because I haven't. But there is still a popular cultural sentiment among publishing in Canada that I can speak to, and broadcasting that I can speak to both in radio and in print magazines, um, to try and keep operations within our borders as much as possible, and to try and allow opportunities for Canadians. Now, of course, this is entirely falling apart in the case of the global village, as Marshall McLuhan would put it, of the internet, where you've got local newspapers that are serving a town of 6,000 that have outsourced all of their layout internationally because it's easier to do that. It's cheaper to do that.
Sure.
So where do you preserve, or should you even bother preserving, Canadian cultural identity in media products? That's a big issue that I'm not qualified to really speak on, but I am qualified to explore because I'm in the thick of it, right? How important is Canadian identity to the books that I'm publishing? Oh, good point. Is there anything inherently Canadian in Fight to Survive? Well, I mean, it's inherently Western, like it's
Mm,
inherently North American,
yeah.
and it's hard to get around that. That being said, I have through Indie Press Revolution, I have gotten emails from people in Spain and in Greece and stuff, talking like who are using the book to their own ends and adapting
Right.
it to their own place, which is encouraged. Like that's what it's there for. Um, I don't think I mean, there's a few. I also sell through Composed Dream Games, which is a specifically Canadian online marketplace, and they do a lot of convention selling. The guy who runs it, Joshua Kitts, is a great guy, and he just brings boxes of specifically Canadian tabletop role playing games all around the country
Well,
to do
well,
conventions, because even the Indie Game Developer Network, IGDN, considers the biggest convention in our entire country too minor to attend. I'm not saying they're wrong, like, because the numbers have to make sense.
right.
But like Breakout Convention in Toronto is the biggest convention, bar none, in Canada, and it is not worth it for the Indie Game Developer Network to come out and vend. So we rely on people like Joshua Kitts doing Composed Dream Games to have convention presence if you're not going to just buy a table yourself
Right.
to go out there. So, and he
Well,
does sell games like Ross Rifles that is just specifically about Canadians in the trenches,
I was thinking of Ross Rifles, and the Daniel Kwan's company is Dundas West, which is a street in Toronto, and so like he's one of the people that reasons why I know, listening to him talk on various of his shows is why I know that CanCon exists.
I
Or
met him like 10, oof, God, 15 years ago before he ever did anything cool. Well, not ever, but like, in publishing. And he had a job. I don't know if he still has a job at the Royal Ontario Museum, which is probably the finest museum in the country. And it's in Toronto, and it's got dinosaurs and mummies and, whatever else. But his job was to run Dungeons and Dragons for a
yeah,
summer camp.
yeah.
And that is, I remember thinking at the time, like, I don't know what we were doing that we met. I think it was probably through the radio station, but I remember thinking, like, you have the coolest job in the world, just about. Because that they don't really care what he's even running them through, right? Like, they just want the kids occupied, and the kids just want to have fun, and you get to do it in the museum. It's
Yeah.
outrageous. That's so interesting. And you see, the thing is, just about all of we Canadian designers have connections to each other, right? Because the population is only so large. So
Right.
I mean, even in passing, I've met, and most of
Well,
the people have met me. I don't know if people will remember me, but
I mean,
but
it's my landscape for, I mean, this is, we've gone way off of the rails now, and like I think we're at the point
I'm
now where we're
sorry. I'm
going to be
sorry. I've
putting stuff.
destroyed your
No,
video.
I asked, and you, but what I'm about to say is like American TV is often filmed in Vancouver, and I know there's a podcast I listen to, a couple that are produced out in Vancouver. I have a friend who lives in Winnipeg. Uh, I know there's a whole corridor because I know all the Toronto and adjacent designers, and you're kind of in that group, and that's where you said Breakout Con, and like I know that uh Sen Fung Lim is somebody that I've worked with before, and he's in London. So like it is that's that whole that's like the densest part of Canada, right? And then you have Kate Beaton who lives out in on the Maritimes, and that's like that's it. That's Canada to me as far as like I listen to a podcast from Vancouver. There's game designers in Toronto, and Kate Beaton makes comics out in the Maritimes, and that's at,
I mean,
which
to
which
be
is
fair, like,
reductive, I know, but
no, it's
that's
okay.
like
Like Kate is out. I'm pretty sure she's around Halifax area. But Brian Lee O'Malley also lives out in the Maritimes. Who is the author of the Scott Pilgrim books. A bit like both Kate and Brian Lee O'Malley also lived in Toronto. Uh,
and
because of
and I know
vortex.
Kate Beaton because I've read Hark a Vagrant for years. She used to live in New York as well, and
Yeah,
like
no, Hark of
everybody's
Vagrant is a triumph of artistic expression as far as I'm concerned. I have nothing but hero worship for Kate Beaton and her work. Um, yeah, there's just so many. There's a lot. There's a lot of designers, the tabletop role playing game designers in Canada. There's a lot of us.
yeah.
But yeah, yeah. But what's the responsibility for Canadian cultural identity on those designers, right? How would you even know? Like a lot of people are like, oh,
Well,
you know,
what it's sounding like is that the answer to my initial question is, are you responsible for that? Legally is no, because you're not in
legally
that
no.
same situation of like
Yeah.
holding, yeah, Radio James Games is not holding the airwaves in trust for the people of Canada in the same way that like they can mandate that you produce a certain amount of content or whatever.
Correct, but I was trying to paint a picture about the kind of cultural influences that because even to the television that we consume in Canada has mandates about how much Canadian content it can have, and the radio that we tune into has mandates about how much like Canadian music there can be. But this whole thing gets twisted by commercialism. So radio is a really good example because a 35% or whatever of it depends on what kind of license you have, but like of the music that you hear on the radio has to be Canadian content. So it has to fulfill a maple designation, MAPL. So is the
There's that.
music
There's
artist
that government.
production, I know. Is it
Uh,
a music artist production or lyrics? Are those Canadian? And you only need two out of the four in order to make it considered
okay.
Canadian content under the CRTC. Uh, so it's pretty generous. But the thing is, you cannot be successful, and maybe this can apply to all arts and more broadly, and I'd love people to fight me on this. You cannot be successful on a Canadian commercial radio station as a Canadian unless you are successful in the United States first and then
Mm,
imported back into Canada. So if you just listen to Canadian radio for about 3 days, you can list all of the Canadian music that gets played because you've got Kim Mitchell and you've got Neil Young and you've got uh like it's all the same. It's all the same, probably 30 songs of Canadian music that get played on commercial radio, and that makes up a third of the content. That can apply more broadly to Canadian film. As a Canadian film, you are not going to be shown in Canada because all the cinemas are owned by large corporations that only think American films are bankable, and American films are treated as domestic releases in Canada, and Canadian films are treated as foreign films in Canada. So
oof. I'm
if you
sorry.
want to be successful as a Canadian filmmaker, you have to penetrate the American market.
Right.
Similarly, with tabletop role playing games, if you just want to sell to Canadians, good luck to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
You're this boutique market, I'm sure, for
to penetrate the American market in order to have any chance, right? Not to say that there's artistic compromises going on with something like Ross Rifles. It's completely unapologetically Canadian, and I think it's wonderful. And
yeah.
and I really want to make a role playing game like Fight to Survive, Solo Martial Blues. I love them. I love the content, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've got bonkers number of books planned to come out, but one of them
Oh,
is
that's a
uh,
transition point right there. Tell us more. Tell us more.
Okay, this is a dream. This is a dream, and this hasn't happened yet, and this is absolutely not developed. But like, there's a series of Canadian television has to have a certain amount of Canadian content, and part of how they get around it is by making tiny little shorts about like yay yay Canada and what it is to be Canadian. So things like a cartoon called The Log Driver's Waltz about how wonderful it is to be a log driver, and it's a cartoon, and it was done in the '70s and it was played to death on TV because it was cheap, easy, accessible Canadian content from the National Film Board. One of the things that I think it was the National Film Board did is these heritage moments of
Hmm.
Canadian history. So they were like 1 minute clips. They got a bunch of actors together, were fancy actors, like big name actors, Canadian actors, and got them to do a little bit of history. Like, oh, there was a Halifax, there was a boat explosion, or
There
oh,
certainly was.
or oh, this is how we invented this thing or that thing or whatever else, or like here's a bit of Marshall McLuhan or whatever. And they have absolutely, among my generation, penetrated the popular consciousness. These heritage moments, like it's a part of our heritage, and it obvious cultural propaganda, like nothing but cultural propaganda. But people really love them because they're like Kate Beaton writes about them extensively. Like maybe you don't get those references because you're American, which I never thought of, but like there's a wonderful one about the invention of basketball where an old man is like, I'm gonna need those apple baskets back because they knocked out the bottom of the apple baskets in order to play to like figure out basketball. And she did a comic strip about that.
I
And I
seem to
have a
recall that one.
dream. I have a dream of doing a Heritage Moments tabletop role playing game, which
Yeah,
is not
that
going to make any sense to anybody that isn't Canadian and isn't in touch with the like those cultural touchdowns, which only will exist in my generation anyway, because people younger than me don't even watch broadcast TV. Like they just
well,
have American things off the internet, right?
that's true. But I mean, but that's sort of like, I don't know. This is like a whole other like business, like the yes, I do remember that comic from Kate Beaton, and I do remember the old man, I'm gonna need my apple back, which that joke is just a joke. It translates perfectly well across the border. But like what I'm saying is that like there's such a loving, like when something is lovingly crafted and it is so hyper specific to the environment, that love of place can then be what makes it translatable to other people who love their own stuff from their own places, even though they don't know the specifics of the content. They understand the appreciation of the hyper local. At least I find that to be the
That's
case, where
so
it's like,
interesting because
where
like
like
I would
because like we like to go, we used to do, my wife and I, when we travel, she would always buy the ghost book from the local, like the local ghost story, right? And they're always cheaply produced mass market paperbacks. They're always like badly laid out. They're because they're only in like the 7 tourist trap places that are in this little part of the country. That's, they're not marketable on but they become a collector's item, and they're so hyper specific to the local place, and they mention sometimes the stuff that you just saw on your trip, whatever. I mean, there's a
or unapologetically local. Like this happened down by the old mill that burned down in the
right,
50s,
right. And
like
you're like,
which
well,
if you're not from there, you have no idea what.
well, sure, but like there's always somebody's old mill that burned down in the 50s, no matter where you are, or whatever the cultural equivalent is. There's some road where, the whole like make out point concept, and the like the abandoned highway, and the old dinner, barn or whatever. I mean, there's enough cultural similarities between a
Just
lot of the
really,
Midwest and a lot of the Canada,
yeah.
or the coastal regions. Like all those places have such similarities because we're only, the border is at the 39th parallel for arbitrary reasons. It was negotiated, but culturally there is a lot of, especially outside of Quebec, which has a different cultural history, but like the British influence and the immigration stream, and it's very similar across the all of North America, or at least.
Yeah, I wonder where the scope, and I assume it narrows and expands, but like the scope of cultural relatability, right? And this is getting off the topic of tabletop role games a little bit, but like Anne of
Yeah,
Green Gables. I don't know if you know Anne of Green Gables, but
I,
if
I
you,
know of it.
it's it's right here, but it's that's just a coincidence. But it's but I guess the fact that I'm a good Canadian and have it on my shelf. But it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Uh, but it's also was adapted into a particularly well loved uh, movie in the 90s. It was a TV movie, and
I mean,
with Megan
this
Follows.
is the Pollyanna. This is where Pollyanna comes from. Like when you're being Pollyanna about something, or is that a different?
No, Pollyanna comes from Pollyanna.
Okay, well that makes sense.
Pollyanna is actually an American idea.
Okay, okay.
Whereas is
I get obviously yes. Anne of Green Gables would not be named Pollyanna. Anyway,
no. I mean, it could well have been an illusion, but no. Pollyanna is its own thing. But Anne of Green Gables is a similar story in many ways. Except Anne is not nearly as innocent and sweet as Pollyanna. Anne is kind of angry, and she's got red hair. But like, it's a story about an orphan girl with red hair uh, being sent out to the country and adopted in a small Canadian farm in PEI. And you can go to different sets of locations that we use. There's as far as I know, they're still up in PEI. Like my family, when I was a teenager, went out there on a pilgrimage to see the buildings, right? And it was flooded with people who traveled internationally to see it, especially from Japan, because apparently Anne of Green Gables really resonated with a Japanese audience. And I had to that point, I was a farm boy, and I'm mostly white, and I'd not seen so many Japanese people in one place, and I was like, what is it that captures the popular imagination? And I talked with someone years later of Japanese who was from Japan, who said, well, it's a story about an orphan who had to leave their home and go out into the country and live, and that was a very common post-war experience in Japan. And that this person was kind of upset about it. Like Anne is upset about it, and she's angry, and she keeps getting into trouble, and there's something very human and relatable to them. So it's interesting that you have something that's such a specific Canadian cultural experience, and very rooted in Canadian culture. Road to Avonlea was a TV show that has a very stranglehold place on my heart, like growing up, and it's Sarah Polly and anyway, but it's interesting what can cross those boundaries and
yeah.
connect with other people. And to bring this all back to tabletop role playing games, trying to find the pins of where something is relatable as an experience is a huge part of designing. And where are we common? Where are we the same? And where can we connect? And how is that actionable? As opposed to, and that's, I don't mean to discourage the novel, but that's where I wanted to get away from the novel. Is sometimes the experience of writing can be introverted, can be very like it only is going to make sense to you, really. Like you're revealing a hidden truth from you. But what I think you need to achieve instead with tabletop role playing games is hitting on the things that connect us, and bringing that experience together. If you want other people to feel something, if you want other people to feel the severity of that. So I don't know. Like I want to do a Heritage Moments role playing game one of these days. I feel I'm not worthy to do an Anne of Green Gables role playing game. I feel like a better designer than me would have to tackle the severity of that content. Um, Probably the people who do Good Society would be up for it, and they're in Australia. But
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Um, hey, you know people in Australia through the IGDN. You can talk to them. I think, yeah. Anyway, all right. Well, James, I think we've had a lovely conversation. I think it's gone too long, and I may have to cut some parts out, but I think we've said a lot of
please,
interesting things.
yeah, take a
And
hatchet to it. I'm happy for you to do that.